Welcome to Behind the Curtain. I'm Andre Caudle, and today our subject will be the system of racism and white supremacy. With us today is scholar Paul Ford, who will be discussing this topic when we come right back. Hi, welcome back. Again, I'm Andre Caudle, and our guest today is Mr. Paul Ford. Paul, would you tell us about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me, Andre. My name is Paul Ford. I currently live in the Washington, D.C. area. I am a scholar. My credentials are I have a BA from Cornell University, which I completed in 1986. I moved to Germany for several decades, and there I continued my studies, and I received a master's degree in the fields of Egyptology, ancient Near Eastern languages, and ancient Near Eastern archaeology.
Wow, quite an accomplishment.
It was an achievement, yes.
Today we'll be discussing the system of racism and white supremacy.
Excellent.
So, Paul, please give us a rundown of how you feel about racism and white supremacy.
Okay, well, what I believe is that we, as black people, people of color, are presented with a number of problems on this planet, problems that we have to solve. Whenever you have to solve a problem, you have to make a correct diagnosis of that problem.
Okay.
We had a great scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk, who wrote at the early 20th century that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of color.
Okay.
What you do with problems, you solve them. In the early 80s, I became a follower of a very great scholar by the name of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Frances Cress Welsing and Neely Fuller, with whom she worked, came up with a theory of racism, a diagnosis of racism. Neely Fuller presented the code, which diagnosed racism as a system, and Frances Welsing analyzed racism as a system and analyzed the why behind it.
Okay.
So we're in a situation where when we discuss racism, when we see problems that we have, and we want to know why this is going on, we have to look at what is going on and what is the problem.
Okay, so what is going on and what is the problem?
Okay, well, right now we live on a planet where people who classify themselves as white in thought, speech, and action represent only 1/10 of the world population.
Correct.
The rest of the population is 9/10 people of color. So those people are numerically vulnerable.
Okay.
It was white scientists, no black person around, who discovered that black genes were dominant in terms of skin color to white genes which were recessive. So you have, that would mean, for example, white plus black equals color, and the eventual disappearance of white. And that means nothing if everybody is loving each other and being fair to each other. But if you have a system of privilege, of white privilege, and you have a people in it who are less than 1/10 of the world's population, then that system reserves privilege for those people who can only successfully classify themselves as white. So if you're biracial, if you're post-racial, you still can get thrown down the pool party, you can still get stopped by the police.
Okay.
So that system is reserved for privilege, reserves privilege for that less than 10% population, which is numerically vulnerable. They are genetically vulnerable because if we all come together in love, then the white disappears. That would mean that there's nobody eligible for that system.
So then, if white people are only 1/10 of the population,
Yes.
and they are numerically vulnerable, why then would it be that they're economically, socially on top? Is it just because it was their turn? Because blacks were first, then Arabs, and now whites?
Well, if you look at the history of Western culture, you look at the ancient Greeks, they're constantly talking about how much they admire people of color. So they secretly write in their literature and their culture how much they admire black people. But they are a numerical minority, they are vulnerable, and they are also genetically vulnerable. That means that if everybody is on equal footing, everybody gets the same chances, then the people who have reserved privileges for themselves will lose those privileges. They will not be, they will have to compete with somebody in India, in Africa, black Americans, brown Americans.
Okay.
And that means if they're competing with them and they have all the whole time stated, well, we really admire them, we admire their color, we admire their abilities, that means they will lose that privilege. That's the purpose of keeping black people down. They don't keep them down because they honestly believe that they are genetically inferior. They keep them down because once black people have the ability to compete on equal footing, then the white person who comes from a privileged environment can't make 10 mistakes and then still go to Yale and Harvard.
So then, I think the question would be asked then is why then don't black people band together? And when I say black, I mean black Americans, black Caribbeans, Brazilians, South Americans, and Africans.
Okay, well, for example, in Brazil, well, let's take America. In America, where the population was majority white, they had a rule: 1 drop of black blood made you black.
Okay.
Which means that you could prove that you weren't totally white. You didn't have those privileges. You
Right.
were discriminated against. In Brazil, within a short period of time, everybody was colored.
Right.
So they devised a system that if you could prove that your great grandmother was French and you had some white, some back in you, you don't have to call yourself black.
Okay.
So what they instituted a system of divide and conquer, because this goes back to the diagnosis of numerical vulnerability. If you are a numerical minority and you are numerically and genetically vulnerable, but you want to stay on top, you don't just subjugate the people who are in the majority and who are genetically dominant. You also get them to fight each other. So you create all kinds of strategies to get them to not band together. You say people in the Caribbean say, well, we work harder, or people in Africa say, why these black people, did they lose their culture? You find all kinds of strategies. It's a divide and conquer strategy, and it's out of necessity because the system is for compensation. It's a compensation for what white people feel that they lack.
So then, do you think that this goes back to, there was a letter by a guy by the name of Lynch, who was telling how to keep blacks under control, and he was saying, pit the old against the young, the females against the males, the house servant against the field servant.
Well, I'm not positive, but that document turned out to be fake.
Okay.
It wasn't authentic.
Okay.
But it does fit.
Right.
White people don't have to have a document to
tell them what to do.
This is the diagnosis. That's why you have a president like Trump who can do all the things that everybody else would think is irrational and outrageous and still get support. Because the bottom line is he's doing something to save white privilege. So he's doing something to save the white race. So they're allowed to do all these things. So if I lived in Europe, you don't have to white people don't have to discuss with each other how to strategize to divide and conquer black people. They do it out of necessity of survival.
Okay. So then you don't think that Europe, I've always been told that Europe was better for black people, especially France. And this was, again, back in the World War II era is when it really came along. And the fact that a lot of entertainers used to be able to go to Europe and feel a freedom that they did not necessarily have here at home. So are you saying that Europe is less free, or that America is just that much more racist?
Well, the thing is that James Baldwin was in Europe, and there were a lot of neo-exile artists in Europe too. They were Americans. They were American exiles. So they didn't have to deal with the day-to-day racism the way American soldiers didn't have to do, black American soldiers. The day-to-day racism that black people deal with here.
Okay.
They were exiles. They were exotic people. But the Africans from the colonies, the Algerians,
right,
the Pakistanis, they were the niggers of Europe. So and it's very interesting to look at that too, because and the Turks and the black Germans, and the reason why they were, and the West Indians, like the West Indians that live here, they may sometimes look down on black people because they say you don't work hard enough.
Right.
Over in London, they are the niggers. They're treated like the niggers, the way the niggers are treated here, so to speak. That's because whenever black people are in a white and cultural environment where they're there long enough where they can witness how white people behave, then they become a threat.
Okay.
So the black American that comes over as an exotic musician or artist, he doesn't know anything about the culture.
Okay.
So he can be treated, given special treatment. I went to a university with 16. I got the best master's degree from the best professor in Egyptology. My student fees were $69 a semester.
How much again?
$69 a semester.
$69.
You know,
I would have paid off my student loans had they been that
right,
inexpensive.
and then there were a lot of freedoms I had in Germany that I did not have here.
Okay, such as?
Well, I wasn't treated the way white Americans would treat me on a day-to-day basis.
So you weren't profiled then as you would be.
Once they found out I was an American. But if they thought I was a black German, or if they thought I was an African who was living there and didn't have an American passport, then you were just like another nigger.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, my first 10 to 15 years in Germany was so exciting because in Germany, anybody who was not German could not assimilate. See, people in America come from all over the world. As long as you learn the N-word, you can assimilate, and you don't associate with black Americans, you can rise up. But in Germany, anybody who was not German was non-German. So they were in the same category as all the rest of the blacks.
Okay.
In that environment, I could meet Turks, Arabs, South Africans, Nigerians, Brazilians, Egyptians, people from all over the world. And because they were not allowed to assimilate to become German and white, we formed a community together. So they would tell me their history. Yes, to answer your question, yes and no. It is freer because you don't have to do certain things that you do here that are very basic and very barbaric.
Like drinking from a water fountain.
Or just being profiled or being stopped by the police.
Right.
But if you are considered to be an Algerian or Pakistani or Moroccan in Southern Europe, you can get that exact same treatment.
And I agree with that, but we will discuss it more when we come right back.
Hey, Drew Sadler, this is Ali Hackett. I told you I would get back to you, so here it is. Here is a portion of what happens on my show on a weekly basis. My show is called Salt, Pepper, and Memories, and I am the creator and host of the show. Now, the show is a cross between Soul Train and American Bandstand. But the twist of it is that my guest and myself, we actually cook on the show for the audience. But here's the part that you're going to be interested in.
Hey, Ali, show us your socks.
Drew, I want you to know I pay these people for that, all right? This is the part that you're talking about where I show my socks every single week. So with this, I'm hoping that you and your staff and whoever you need to talk to will call me, we'll get on board, and we can do something together. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you. Ciao.
Peace, this is Tommy Slaughter from the A-Vision Show. I know you've been watching me, but don't forget to keep tuning in every Tuesday night at 5:30. A-Vision ENT, that's the show that's on every Tuesday night. Don't forget Comcast, Xfinity, or Verizon Fios. Watch it.
Put it in, then go dial up to 12. Put all the other LPs back on the shelf and smoke a blunt and dial 7-160-49
311.
and you can get bootleg hip hop perfection. I damage any MC who step in my direction. I'm Staten Island's best son. What you heard? Still talking that is absurd. My repertoire is USS. My VO style got thrown out the car and ran over by the Method Man. The mind can't define my style, is so deep like vision. My low cut face, they bullshit like a porcupine. I part backs like a spine, cut you like a blunt, reconstruct your design. I know you wanna diss me, but I can read your mind. Cause you be killing beats like SWV, trying to get a title like Woo Killer. Can't change your habit, you know I'm friends with the habit. Me and Rizabard named Pippin in the tablet. The vets, we paid our debts for mad years. Hibernated sound, now we out like beers. It's more power, more physically. Speaking the truth in the song.
Get up off your couch, get up out the bed. A-Vision ENT show is on.
Well, I left a good job in the city, working for the man every night and day. Never had I lost 1 minute of sleep, but I was worried about the thing that they might have been. Big wheels keep on turning, proud memory keep on burning, and we're rolling, rolling, rolling on the river, and we're rolling,
We're back, and so where we left off, Paul.
Okay, well, I want to get back to the diagnosis.
Okay.
Because I was telling you that we have to solve problems with precise diagnoses. We have a problem of a system that guarantees privilege for white people. We have these people who are a numerical minority, and they are genetically and numerically vulnerable.
Okay.
So they take action. They take action. They create policies. They have behavior that they don't have to talk about with each other. And when black people want to solve their problems, they have to examine that, because it is that system that decides whether you get that job, whether you get an interview, whether you get into that school, whether you are profiled on the street. See, these are real systems of power and real actions. So we have to understand who are the people who do this. Why, how is it possible for you to gentrify an entire city and then pretend like nobody existed there before? And I'll give you a really a short example. This guy recently in the news who was racially profiled in the DoubleTree Hotel. Where he just sat in the lobby and got on his phone, and two people asked him to leave even though he was at the hotel. He came on CNN after and said, "Oh, this is so hurtful. I don't understand why this is happening. I really don't understand. This is our problem. If you understood the critical state of people who want to maintain power but feel vulnerable, you'd understand why they would do this."
Okay.
You know, you can stomp a puppy on a stage and everybody needs therapy for life. But if a black child gets killed in the streets, it's business as usual. It takes a mentality to be able to allow that. And that mentality is motivated by this: we need to survive, we need our privilege to survive, we need our system to survive.
So do you think it's more that white people tend to be more of a violent by nature, or do you think that it's more or less the environment that's making them act this way?
Well, how violent they are is a different subject. Because
Okay.
that gets into, if you, for example, if you have been in a country that's had slavery, you have needed black people to create a corn planter, a cotton gin, Jack Daniels whiskey. You've needed them to quicken you with breast milk. You need them to quicken you with their culture. You've done all these things, but you've subjugated them.
Right.
That takes a certain level of psychosis.
Okay.
If you're living under that psychosis where you subjugate people and then you pretend they don't exist and try to say they're inferior, that may create a certain mental illness in you that may give you a tendency to be violent. But that's a different issue. These people are descended from Europe. If you study the history of Europe, they were fighting each other all the time. Wars after wars after wars. After the 30 Years' War, it was hard to, 1618 to 1648, it was hard to classify anybody in that region as a human being because of the barbarism that took place.
Okay.
So that's part of the history. But and the mental illness of living with slavery and ignoring it, that causes a psychosis too. But how violent they are, you don't have to deal with that yet. You can deal with the logical motivation of, I want to survive with my privileges. If I have to compete with all the brown people who are very ambitious, whether they're from Southeast DC or Mumbai, India.
Right.
You know, and if I have to compete with them and I don't have anything to protect me to get C's in college and still go on and be a manager, then I'm in trouble. So what do? I create a fortress, a gentrification fortress, where it's all for me, and I can prosper in that mediocrity, and there's no competition as a last stand, because I know that in Qatar and in Malaysia and all over the place, all these businesses are coming up, and they're going to compete with me, and America might not be globally dominant anymore.
So, okay,
So it's a logical necessity. The way black people have to understand, why do white people behave the way they do?
But let me ask you this then. Why then don't whites here in America educate those people of color so that their standing in the world will still be... See, I believe that you can still maintain that position of being on top, but yet and still educate your people to make yourself stay on top on the world stage. So
what I said at the beginning of this talk is that if you look at the literature I mean, it's hard to go into it in detail, but if you look at the cultural expressions of Western culture, the mythology, the literature, science, they are always stating, we think black people are more adequate than we are.
Okay.
We think black people do this better than we do. You know, it was black biologists, it was white biologists that discovered and asserted that the more melanin an organism has, the higher it is considered to be on the evolutionary scale. I mean, why did they come up with that? So they're always talking about what they feel in the natural world is more adequate in black people than white people.
Okay.
So if they have those abilities and they're not subjugated, then you're not just going to be dealing with the loss of privilege, but you're going to be dealing with fear. That
Okay.
means you're going to be subjected to the whims of the people who are more adequate than you. If white people have a history of subjugating black people, then maybe they have this fear that when everything's equal, black people will ask them, well, why did you do that? It's time to hold you accountable for what you did. Can you explain to me why you did that? So if you're fearful of being held accountable, you're fearful of losing privileges. Also, the privileges are a compensation. If you feel that black people are more adequate than you are, then the money, the privilege, the ease, that compensates. So if you lose that method of compensation, and you are at the whims of people who you think are more adequate than you are, then you're in a very vulnerable position. That's a very fearful position.
Okay.
So they're not going to educate black people as to who they are, because black people will have various reactions. Well, okay, now it's time for you to give a privilege. Well, why did you do that? Well, I'm very angry at you that you did that. You know, so that's why that system stays in place, and it's a very complex system, and it stays in place. And it also is motivated by the mandate, the imperative to keep black people ignorant. Because if black people woke up and understood that, they wouldn't draw a knife, they wouldn't draw a gun. They would just say, well, it's time to stop that. You know, they could very intelligently say, well, we can't have that anymore. That's not rational. That's not mature. That's not good for the environment. That's not good for anybody.
So then you believe that a lot of the problems that the black community has today are a result of the racist attitudes that have been passed to us or through us, you know, and given to white people?
Well, there are great scholars like Frances Cress Welsing, Joy DeGruy, who talk about the trauma, not just the system of white supremacy, but the impact. Frances Welsing talked about the impact of white supremacy on black people today.
Okay.
The impact of the mental impact. Joy DeGruy talks about that today, but she talks about something very essential as well. That is, you go through slavery, you go through the trauma. We now know that DNA memory is passed on, the memory of trauma. So you go through slavery. Where was the therapy for slavery? None. You finish slavery, you go through Reconstruction. You go through post-Reconstruction. You go through Jim Crow. You go through various stages of discrimination. Black people have been traumatized from the beginning to the end. So they're working on a lot of trauma that they've never been able to work out. They've never been able to get any type of healing for. So, and it's never ending. You had 3 strikes you're out laws. You have 12-year-old children being killed. You have people being racially profiled. You have grandmas being stopped. So it's never ending. So the trauma we had in the past continues in the present. There's also economic assaults, like declaring neighborhoods expendable, destroying the industry, destroying the infrastructure, telling the black people you can starve there. So you've got an economic, that's why you have gangs where people are, and you talk to those young gang members and they say, well, you left us to starve. You know, we have no infrastructure, we have no jobs here, you all just want us to die. So, you have an economic assault, which is real. You can't pay your bills, you have no place to stay. You know, you have miseducation, terrible school systems, and then you have the police state that is coming after them too. So we're still impacted by that trauma, and that makes it hard for us to unite. Okay. And then you have a media that says none of this is taking place.
Well, Paul, I'm sorry we're running out of time. It was a great interview.
No problem, brother.
My name is Andre Caudle. Join us next time for Behind the Curtain. We'll see you then.
you.